When they stood on my porch and told me I had to cough up $80,000 or forfeit the dirt my grandfather bled into for 50 years, I didn't scream, I didn't beg, and I certainly didn't reach for my checkbook. I just looked them dead in the eye and asked one simple, logistical question, end quote. Did you bring enough body bags? End quote. You see, out here in Dustman County, Texas, we don't measure wealth in zeros on a bank screen. We measure it in sweat, in callous, and in the stubborn refusal to let go of what's yours. That's how this whole nightmare started, not with a gunshot, but with a promise I made to a ghost. My name is Jackson end quote, Jack end quote, Mercer, and the land under my boots is called Ironwood Creek Farm. It's 140 acres of hard-scrabble earth, rusted machinery, and barbed wire that hums a low tune when the wind kicks up off the plains. My grandfather, Silas Mercer, bought this place back in '52 with nothing but a handshake and a prayer to a god who wasn't Apos. Listening, he built every fence post by hand, dug every well until his knuckles cracked, and buried 2 good horses and 1 bad man on this property. The kind of man who didn't Apos. Understand what end quote, no trespassing end quote, meant. When Silas passed, he didn't Apos. Leave me a gift. He left me a dare, a challenge to see if I had the grit to hold on to freedom in a world that wants to lease it to you by the month. The first morning I returned to the farm, everything was quiet. The barn doors hung crooked like a broken jaw, the water pump wheezed, and a hawk circled overhead, judging me. Silas used to tell me, end quote, boy, you don't own the land, you answer to it, end quote, and I figured I was about to do a lot of answering. I spent those first few days sweating through my shirt, clearing out the rot, mending fences that had grown tired, and replacing padlocks that had rusted into statues of themselves. It wasn't Apos. Easy work, but it was honest, and the sounds of the farm, boots on wood, coyotes yipping at the moon, felt like a memory I could finally touch. Then the trouble arrived, rolling up my driveway on 4 pristine tires. The dirt road leading to my gate is rough, the kind that eats city suspensions for breakfast, so when I heard the smooth, confident crunch of gravel that Tuesday morning, I knew it wasn't Apos, friend. I was in the barn, grease up to my elbows, when the sound stopped, arrogant and close. I walked out with a crowbar in my hand, not as a weapon, but just because I hadn't Apos, put it down yet. A shiny black SUV was parked at my gate, dust settling around it like a curtain, and on the side door was a logo that looked like it belonged on a resort brochure, Oak Ridge Estates HOA. 3 people stepped out, looking like they were dressed for a boardroom, not a barnyard. Leading the pack was a woman with hair so stiff it could deflect a bullet and a smile that didn't Apos. Reach her eyes. We'll call her Patricia Vance. Flanking her was a heavy-set guy with a gut pushing against a cheap belt and a plastic badge, Officer Higgins, and a twitchy little guy holding a clipboard like a shield, named Julian. I realized right then that my grandfather was right. The war for this land wasn't Apos. Going to be fought with lead. It was going to be fought with paper, with fake smiles, and with signatures that smelled like sulfur. Patricia planted her heels in my dirt, claiming it with her posture, her sunglasses reflecting my own skeptical face back at me. End quote. Mr. Mercer, end quote, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. End quote. I'm Patricia Vance, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and we're here to discuss the significant outstanding balance on this parcel. End quote. End quote. I'm about 3 miles outside your jurisdiction, end quote, I said, leaning on the crowbar, end quote, and you're about 6 inches away from a trespassing charge, end quote. Julian, the nervous one, practically threw a piece of paper at me across the gate, end quote. Here are the violations: unapproved structures, landscaping deficiencies, unregistered well modifications, electrical hazards, end quote. He recited it like a script, breathless and terrified. I laughed a dry sound. End quote. Violations? Lady, the only obligation I have is to the man who built this place, and he carved and Apos, no HOA and Apos, into his workbench before you were born. End quote. Patricia didn't flinch. She just opened a manila folder. End quote. Your grandfather's stubbornness ISN and Apos. TA legal defense. Mr. Mercer, the board voted. The fines have accrued, and you owe us $80,000 if you don and Apos. Remit payment within 30 days, We will pursue remedies, including liens and foreclosure, end quote. End quote. Foreclosure? End quote. I stepped closer, the air between us crackling with heat. End quote. You walk onto my land with a pamphlet and a threat, and you think that makes you the owner? End quote. Higgins, the rent-a-cop, rested his hand on his belt, trying to look intimidating. End quote. We can come back with a court order, soldier. End quote. That word, soldier, hit a nerve he didn't and oppose. Tino was there. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who missed having power. End quote. Wrong battlefield, friend, end quote. I said softly, end quote. And definitely the wrong soldier, end quote. I walked back up the porch steps, the wood creaking under my weight, and grabbed the old 12-gauge leaning inside the door. I didn't and oppose. T pointed at them. Just held it across my body, a piece of steel and walnut that communicated more than words ever could. Patricia and oppose. S smile vanished, Julian flinched, and Higgins took a half-step back. End quote. Did you bring enough body bags? End quote. I asked again, my voice low, just a statement of fact. End quote. Threats 1 and oppose. T help you, end quote. Patricia hissed, retreating to the safety of her leather seats. End quote. We know how to handle people like you. You and oppose. LL regret this, end quote. They drove off in a cloud of dust and entitlement, leaving me standing there with a shotgun and a sinking feeling in my gut. I didn't and oppose. T cheer. I didn't and oppose. T celebrate. I just pulled out my phone and hit and oppose, save and oppose. On the recording I and oppose. D started the second they arrived. I knew they wooed and oppose. T come back with courage. They and oppose. D come back with paperwork. So I started getting ready for a siege. The counterattack was swift. The very next morning, 2 men from end quote, city code enforcement end quote, showed up, looking bored and official, claiming they had received end quote, anonymous complaints end quote, about environmental hazards. They slapped yellow warning stickers all over my barn, claiming I had 2 weeks to fix imaginary problems or face daily fines. When I asked how they knew about the interior of my locked barn, the older inspector just shrugged and said, end quote, the complaints included detailed photographs, end quote. That stopped my heart cold. Photographs. Inside my locked barn. I drove straight to the county clerk's office, my blood boiling. The clerk, a tired woman named Mrs. Gable, pulled up my property records. End quote. Oh, end quote, she said, frowning at her screen. End quote. This parcel is flagged for and oppose, pending integration and oppose, into the Oak Ridge Estates transition zone, end quote. End quote. Integration, end quote. I asked, my voice tight. End quote. Who filed that, end quote. End quote. A legal consultant, end quote. She whispered, looking around like she was sharing state secrets. End quote. A firm called Aspen Heights Group, representing the HOA, end quote. I walked out of that courthouse into the blinding Texas sun, realizing this wasn't and oppose. Just a dispute. It was a coordinated campaign. They had filed the paperwork weeks before I even moved back. They were trying to drown me in bureaucracy until the land wasn't and oppose. Worth the fight. That night, I sat at Silas's old desk, the green banker's lamp casting long shadows across the documents I'd gathered. I found the original 1952 deed, fragile and yellowed, with Silas's blocky handwriting at the bottom. No HOA. Not now, not ever. I placed it next to the digital map the clerk gave me, the one showing the HOA slowly swallowing my boundaries like a cancer. I swore to him right then, in the quiet of that empty house, that I would make those words mean something again. Paranoia is a heavy blanket, especially when the nights are quiet and the nearest neighbor is a mile away. I started seeing enemies in the shadows, hearing whispers in the wind, and as it turned out, I wasn't and oppose. Crazy. I was just observant. I fortified the ranch. I installed motion sensor cameras on the fence lines, reinforced the gate hinges, and mirrored every single hard drive of evidence I had. I was digging in for a long winter, but then, the sun seemed to break through the clouds in the form of a beat-up Chevy pickup truck. He introduced himself as Caleb Thorne. He was mid-30s, wearing a faded cattle cap, dirt under his fingernails, and a smile that seemed easy and practiced. He told me he'd just bought a small 5-acre plot over the ridge and wanted to say hello before the HOA vultures tried to claim we were strangers. End quote. I heard you and Apo's refighting. He helped me fix a busted breaker box in the barn, brought over decent coffee, and swapped stories about bad commanders and worse weather. For a few weeks, Caleb was the only human contact I had that didn't involve a threat or a fine. I wanted to trust him, I really did, because a man alone on the range starts to lose his edge. But Silas raised me to watch the hands, not the mouth. The cracks started small. Caleb asked too many questions. Casual things, like in quote, "Where does the main water line run?" End quote. Or end quote, "Do you keep the old surveys in a safe or just in that file cabinet?" End quote. Or end quote, "Ever find any old agreements your granddad signed?" End quote. It felt like ranch talk, but the rhythm was off, like he was checking boxes on a list I couldn't and Apos, TC. So I set a trap. I took an old metal cash box Silas used to keep poker winnings in, filled it with blank paper, and put a shiny, official-looking key inside. I left it conspicuously on the workbench in the barn, right next to the filing cabinet where I kept the real deeds. Then, I mounted a trail camera high in the rafters, hidden behind an owl's nest, pointing straight at the bait. 2 nights later, at 2 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected, barn interior. I didn't end Apos, turn on the lights. I pulled on my boots, grabbed the shotgun, and moved across the yard like a ghost. The moon was full, casting everything in silver and black. Through the cracks in the barn wood, I saw a flashlight beam cutting the darkness. I stepped through the open door, the gravel silent under my practiced step. There he was, Caleb Thorne, wearing black gloves, hunched over the lockbox, snapping photos of the contents with his phone. I racked the shotgun, the sound echoing like a cannon shot in the enclosed space. End quote. "Stand up," end quote. I said, my voice showing no emotion, end quote. "And keep your hands where God can see them," end quote. Caleb froze, then turned slowly, the flashlight blinding him as I shone my own beam in his face. The friendly neighbor mask was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a man caught doing a job he thought was beneath him. End quote. "Jack," end quote. He stammered, trying to find that easy smile. End quote. "I was just checking your security, man. With everything going on, end quote. End quote. "Save it," end quote. I cut him off, stepping closer. End quote. "You and Apos, not a neighbor. You Don and Apos, own land over the ridge. You and Apos, a spy, Caleb, and a bad one at that," end quote. He dropped the act instantly. His shoulders stiffened, and he let out a sigh of annoyance. End quote. "You Don and Apos, know what you and Apos, dealing with, Jack. This ISN and Apos, about land. It and Apos, about control. You and Apos, just a speed bump," end quote. He lunged. He didn't and Apos, go for a weapon. He went for the door, trying to shoulder past me. I sidestepped, caught his arm, and used his own momentum to drive him face first into the dirt floor. He struggled, spitting dust, but I had 70 pounds on him and a lifetime of rage. I pinned him, zip-tied his hands, always keep zip ties in the barn, and dumped out his backpack. It was a treasure trove of corruption. There were maps of my property with, end quote, proposed demolition, end quote, zones marked in red, photos of my private documents, and a thumb drive labeled, end quote, Project Oak Ridge, end quote. But the kicker was a search warrant. Fake, stamped with a seal that looked real until you squinted, authorized by the, end quote, HOA Enforcement Division, end quote. I called the sheriff, and while we waited, Caleb just sat in the dirt, laughing softly. End quote. "They and Apos, not going to stop, you know. They and Apos, already frozen your accounts. You and Apos, broke, Jack. You just Don and Apos, know it yet," end quote. He was right. The next morning, while Caleb was sitting in a holding cell, I tried to buy lumber and my card was declined. I called the bank, my hands shaking. End quote. "Mr. Mercer," end quote. The teller said, sounding terrified, end quote. "There and Apos. An emergency civil lien on your accounts filed by Oak Ridge Estates. Judgment for $80,000. Your assets are frozen," end quote. I stood on the porch, staring at the phone. They had used a fake judgment, filed by a shell company, to strangle me financially. I had no money. A spy had been in my barn, and the HOA was closing in like a pack of wolves. I called my attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Sarah Jenkins. End quote. They crossed the line, end quote, she said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. End quote. They used a fraudulent lien. Jack, this ISN and oppos. T civil court anymore. This is a felony, end quote. End quote. Then let end oppos. S go to war, end quote, I said, looking out at the fence line. End quote. Phase 2 is over. It and oppos. S time for the kill shot, end quote. The courtroom in Dustman County smelled of lemon polish and old lies. It was packed, standing room only. Word spreads fast in a small town when a rancher decides to take on the establishment. On one side, you had the Oak Ridge team, Patricia Vance in a white power suit that cost more than my truck, Julian sweating through his shirt, and their high-priced lawyer, looking bored. On my side, it was just me in my funeral suit, Sarah Jenkins with a stack of files that looked like a weapon, and our ace in the hole, a former HOA board member named Mr. Henderson who had grown a conscience. Judge Reynolds, a man with a face like carved granite, banged the gavel. The HOA's lawyer started his song and dance, claiming my grandfather had signed an agreement in 1997 to join the association. He held up a document, looking smug. Sarah stood up, cool as ice water. End quote. Your Honor, that document is a forgery, end quote. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Sarah projected an image onto the court screens. End quote. The signature on this and oppos, agreement and oppos, is a digital trace. Furthermore, the notary stamp used didn't and oppos, T exist until 2018. And if that ISN and oppos, T enough, we have bank records linking Patricia Vance directly to a shell company called Aspen Heights Group, which paid our and oppos, neighbor and oppos, Caleb Thorne $45,000 to break into my client's barn. End quote. Patricia's face went the color of ash. We didn't and oppos. T stopped there. Sarah laid it all out. The fake liens, the surveillance, the bribery. When Mr. Henderson took the stand and admitted Patricia had ordered him to, end quote, fabricate violations to force a sale, end quote, the gallery actually gasped. The judge looked at Patricia. End quote. Ms. Vance, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal investigation regarding fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. Bailiff, take her into custody, end quote. Seeing the handcuffs click around Patricia's wrists was satisfying, I won't lie. She screamed something about being the president, about how I couldn't and oppos, T do this, but I just watched her go. I didn't and oppos, T smile. I just nodded. But I wasn't and oppos, T done. The snake's head was cut off, but the body was still twitching. A week later, using a shell company of my own, I went to a tax auction and bought a tiny, worthless half-acre strip of scrub brush that technically lay inside the Oak Ridge Estate's boundaries. It cost me $300. Technically, that made me a member of the HOA. I walked into their next board meeting, slammed my deed on the table, and said, end quote, I'm exercising my right as a member to demand a full financial audit and a vote of no confidence, end quote. I published everything. Every fake receipt, every stolen dollar, every lie Patricia had told the neighbors. I put it all online on a website I called, end quote, Oak Ridge Exposed, end quote. The community revolted. The people who had lived in fear of fines for the wrong shade of beige paint suddenly realized the emperor had no clothes and was currently in a jail cell. We held a vote in the community hall. I stood at the podium and looked at the crowd, end quote. I asked them if they brought body bags, end quote. I told the room, end quote, but they didn't and oppos, T need them. They buried themselves in paper, end quote. The vote was unanimous. Oak Ridge Estates HOA was dissolved. 6 months later, the air at Ironwood Creek Farm felt different. Lighter. I hosted a barbecue for the neighbors, the real ones. The smell of smoked brisket and mesquite filled the air. People were laughing, shaking hands, realizing that fences are meant to keep cattle in, not to keep neighbors apart. I walked out to the main gate as the sun was setting, turning the Texas sky into a bruise of purple and gold. I had carved a new sign, bolted deep into the oak post, Ironwood Creek. Freedom lives here. I poured a shot of bourbon onto the earth for Silas. End quote. We held the line, old man. End quote. I whispered. End quote. We held the line. End quote. But as I stood there, watching the headlights of my friends driving home, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. We won, sure. Patricia was in prison, Caleb had taken a plea deal, and the land was safe. But they had tried to steal my life with nothing more than a printer and a false sense